Before we finish this module and dive into more advanced Redux concepts later, such as running asynchronous code, which we haven't covered at all yet, let me walk you through different types of state and answer the question, should every state be handled through Redux? Because in the demo application in this module, we eliminated the setState call in the component and we eliminated the local component state, the state we used thus far in all React applications and projects we built in this course. Instead, we used the Redux state and action dispatching and store binding to use that state. Is this always the approach you should follow? Do you always have to use Redux to begin with? Well, the question whether you use Redux or not depends on the size of your application and the complexity of your state. If you have a simple, a small application, setting up Redux might take you longer than the benefits you get out of it are worth it. For any decent, medium-sized or big application, using Redux and managing the state there is probably a good idea. But then still, we have to ask which state should be used for Redux, because you shouldn't necessarily manage all the state in it. Let's have a look at the various types of state, some examples, and whether you should use Redux for them or not. Let's consider local UI state, such as showing or hiding a backdrop, opening a modal, all these things which of course change the state to update the UI of your React application and hence to show something different. Should you use Redux for that? The answer is oftentimes you might not use Redux here. You mostly handle this within your components. That being said, you can use Redux for that. You can have a show modal property in your global state, dispatch an action to set it to true, and dispatch an action to set it to false, then connect your component and listen to that property to conditionally render a modal or not. But that might be overkill. Oftentimes, you can handle that within your components, just as we did it before. Another important type of state is persistent state. This means the state you typically also store in server-side databases, like the users of your application, all posts of a blog, all burger orders, stuff like that. Now here, you typically do use Redux, but of course not for all the data you have in your server-side database. Because Redux, of course, is just for managing the state in your application as long as your application is alive. And always keep in mind, when the user refreshes your page, your state is gone. So Redux is not a replacement for a database. Instead, you store such data on a server, but the relevant slices are managed by Redux. So the posts you're currently displaying, the users you currently need to display, the posts the user currently may edit, these things are loaded and stored in Redux so that you have them available so that you can render them to the screen, but that might not include all the data you have in your database. And then we have typical client state. Things like, is the user authenticated? Or filters set by the user. So if you have a drop-down allowing the user to filter your posts, that's not data you store in a database. You can't store if the user is authenticated, because if he enters wrong login information, you don't need to store that on the server necessarily. Also, the filters set by the user, you might not store that on the server because it's not that important to store in the database. You definitely need to be aware of the current filter settings on your client in your JavaScript code in the React application though. This is state you definitely use Redux for. You manage that via Redux because it might affect multiple components or areas of your application. For example, if the user is authenticated, it might be important for a lot of components in your app. And there, Redux really shines because this central storage then offers a huge advantage. So these are the different types of state and how you handle them. Now, we will see examples for all of that over the next modules when we also add Redux to our course project. Before we do that though, it's time to practice Redux.